Most people picture biblical polygamy as a kind of accepted privilege, a right granted to patriarchs who lived in a different era under different rules. The truth is something else entirely. What the records reveal is a relentless pattern of suffering, rivalry, and family destruction in every documented case. This is the story no one ever told you about multiple wives in the Bible. Put into perspective what is about to unfold before your eyes. The first marriage recorded in Scripture, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, establishes a formula that could not be more direct. One man, one woman, one flesh. No exceptions, no footnotes, no conditional clauses. The Hebrew text uses the word echad, meaning one in an absolute, indivisible sense. And that linguistic detail will become essential to understanding everything that followed, because polygamy did not arise from divine permission, it arose from rebellion. The name of the first polygamist recorded in the Bible is Lamech, Genesis chapter 4, verse 19, and it is no coincidence that he appears precisely within the lineage of Cain, the first murderer. Lamech took two wives for himself, Adah and Zillah, and the biblical text records that fact without celebration, without blessing, without any sign of approval. Quite the opposite. Just 7 verses later, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 23, Lamech boasts of having killed a man. The first biblical polygamist is also the second documented murderer in all of Scripture. The pattern begins this way: violence and the multiplication of wives walking side by side. Consider the narrative structure the biblical text constructs. Before the flood, humanity corrupts itself on a sweeping scale. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, describes men taking for themselves every woman they desired. The Hebrew expression implies possession without consent, accumulation without limit, and the direct result of that corruption is the flood. When Noah enters the ark, the text goes out of its way to note that he had one wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, each had one wife, 8 people entered the ark, forming 4 monogamous couples. The restart of humanity follows the original model of Genesis 2. Nothing else. And here is the first great tension that will run through this entire narrative. If the original design was monogamous, why did figures as central as Abraham, Jacob, David, and Solomon practice polygamy without a bolt of lightning striking them down? The answer lies in a distinction most people ignore entirely. There is a brutal difference between what God describes and what God prescribes. The biblical text describes murders, wars, betrayals, idolatry, and polygamy. To describe is not to approve, to record is not to recommend. And when you examine each instance of polygamy in Scripture with surgical attention, what you find is not blessing, it is consequence. Follow the case of Abraham. Genesis chapter 16 narrates Sarai's decision to give her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to her husband. Context is everything. Abraham was 85 years old. Sarai was 75. The promise of a son had been made by God 10 years earlier in Genesis 12, and nothing had happened. 10 years of waiting in a world where barrenness was considered a social curse. 10 years within a cultural framework where the Code of Hammurabi, dated to approximately 1750 before the Common Era, explicitly permitted a barren wife to provide a servant to her husband for the purpose of bearing heirs. Abraham did not invent the practice. He followed the Mesopotamian custom of his time. But observe what happened. The moment Hagar conceived, Genesis chapter 16 verse 4 records that she began to despise Sarai. The Hebrew word used is kalal, meaning to make light of, to treat as insignificant. A woman who had been mistress of the tent was now being humiliated by the very servant she herself had offered to her husband. Sarai's suffering was so intense that she confronted Abraham with words the text preserves without filter. "May the wrong done to me be on you." Genesis chapter 16, verse 5. Polygamy did not bring a solution. It brought domestic warfare, and the human cost did not stop there. Sarai reacted with such severity that Hagar fled into the wilderness while pregnant, alone. An Egyptian woman without resources, without protection, walking through the Negev desert, where temperatures exceed 113 degrees Fahrenheit during summer, and the distance to the Egyptian border stretched over 300 kilometers. The equivalent of walking from Sao Paulo to Curitiba under a merciless sun, without guaranteed water, carrying a child in her womb. Silence. God intervened and sent Hagar back. But the conflict never resolved. 14 years later, when Isaac was born, the rivalry between the two sons forced the permanent expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael. Genesis chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. Abraham suffered deeply over it. The text says the situation was very distressing in his eyes. The Hebrew word ra'ah indicates something that caused real pain, profound anguish. The patriarch of faith carried to the end of his life the scars of a decision that custom permitted, but that God's original design never anticipated. Now consider the case of Jacob, because it amplifies everything Abraham experienced. Jacob did not choose polygamy out of desire. He was deceived. Genesis chapter 29 narrates how Laban substituted Leah for Rachel on the wedding night, after Jacob had worked 7 years for the right to marry her. 7 years of manual labor in a pastoral system where the day began before dawn and ended after sundown. When the fraud was revealed, Laban offered Rachel in exchange for another 7 years of work. Jacob agreed. 14 years of labor for 2 wives he never planned to have simultaneously. But the real domestic hell began afterward. Leah knew she was not loved. Genesis chapter 29 verse 31 uses a devastating word, senua, meaning hated or rejected. Every son Leah bore was a desperate attempt to win her husband's affection. She named the first Reuben, which means see a son, and said, "Now my husband will love me." Genesis chapter 29 verse 32. He did not. The second son received the name Simeon, meaning, "The Lord has heard that I am hated." The third, Levi, comes from a root meaning to attach, and Leah said, "Now my husband will be attached to me." Genesis chapter 29 verse 34. 3 sons, 3 cries of pain compressed into proper names. Witness what happens next. Rachel, who was loved but barren, fell into despair. Genesis chapter 30 verse 1 records her words to Jacob, "Give me children, or I will die." Jacob's response was harsh. "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" The tension between the 2 sisters escalated to the point where Rachel gave her servant Bilhah to Jacob. Leah responded by giving her servant Zilpah. Within a few years, Jacob had 4 women bearing children in a reproductive competition the biblical text records, with almost clinical detail. 12 sons and at least 1 daughter were born from that family configuration. And the psychological cost borne by each of those women is visible in every name given, in every phrase preserved. The suffering did not remain confined to the mothers. Jacob's sons grew up in an environment of rivalry so toxic that 10 of them conspired to murder their own brother Joseph, Rachel's beloved son. Genesis chapter 37 verse 18. They abandoned the plan only because Reuben intervened. Yet they still sold Joseph as a slave for 20 pieces of silver to Ishmaelite traders heading toward Egypt. 20 pieces of silver was the average market price for a young slave in the ancient Near East, as documented in Mari records dated to approximately 1800 before the Common Era. The sons of polygamy sold the son of love and plunged their father into grief for more than 20 years. Examine the details that archaeology and ancient legislation reveal about the broader context. The Code of Hammurabi, with its 282 articles carved into a black diorite stele, standing 2 meters and 25 centimeters tall, regulated polygamy with specific clauses. Article 148 permitted a man to take a second wife if his first was stricken with serious illness. Article 145 authorized a barren wife to provide a servant as a substitute. The Middle Assyrian laws, dated to approximately 1100 before the Common Era, permitted unrestricted polygamy for men of means. The Nutsi texts, discovered between 1925 and 1931 in what is now Iraq, document marriage contracts that legally obligated a barren wife to provide a replacement. The world in which Abraham, Jacob, and their descendants lived did not merely tolerate polygamy, it systematized it. And here is the point that changes everything. The Torah never prohibited polygamy with a direct commandment in the format, "You shall not take multiple wives." Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 15 through 17, legislates inheritance rights among children of different wives, presupposing the existence of the practice. Exodus chapter 21, verse 10, establishes that if a man takes another woman, he may not reduce the food, clothing, or conjugal rights of his first wife. Mosaic legislation regulates without prohibiting, but to regulate is not to approve. Consider the analogy Jesus Christ used centuries later, recorded in Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 through 8, when confronted about divorce. He said that Moses permitted divorce because of the hardness of human hearts, but that from the beginning it had not been so, and he pointed directly back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, the original pattern, one man, one woman. The same logic applies with surgical precision to polygamy. God tolerated the practice within a culture that normalized it, regulated it to protect the most vulnerable women within the system, but never presented it as the ideal. Every biblical narrative involving polygamy ends in conflict, every single one. Notice what the text reveals when it reaches David. 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 2 through 5, lists 6 wives by name: Ahinoam of Jezreel, Abigail of Carmel, Maacah the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 13, notes that David took more concubines and wives in Jerusalem. Historians estimate the total may have reached at least 18 women, and the result was a family so fractured that it became the stage for the most violent tragedies in the entire Old Testament. Amnon, David's firstborn son, raped his own half-sister, Tamar. 2 Samuel chapter 13. Absalom, Tamar's full brother, waited 2 full years and then had Amnon murdered. 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 28 and 29. Absalom then led an armed rebellion against his own father, publicly took David's concubines on the rooftop of the palace as an act of political humiliation, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 22, and died pierced by 3 javelins while hanging from an oak tree by his hair caught in its branches. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 14. David, the man after God's own heart, wept for his rebellious son with words that pierce across millennia. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you." 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33. The weight of that lament is the weight of a father who harvested inside his own home what he had sown through the multiplication of wives and the rivalries it inevitably produced, and it did not end with Absalom. Adonijah, another of David's sons, also attempted to seize the throne by force. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5. David's succession became a family civil war that nearly destroyed the kingdom before Solomon was even crowned. Follow the progression when we arrive at Solomon, because it is in him that polygamy reaches its most extreme expression and its most catastrophic consequences. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 3 records the number with relentless precision. 700 wives of royal lineage and 300 concubines, 1,000 women. Consider what that means in logistical terms. Feeding 1,000 women and their personal attendants required an operation equivalent to sustaining an entire city. 1 Kings chapter 4 verses 22 and 23 details the daily consumption of Solomon's court. 30 cores of fine flour, 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen, 20 pasture-fed cattle, and 100 sheep, along with deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fattened fowl. Per day, the equivalent of feeding between 15,000 and 20,000 people daily. The numbers are so enormous they seem like fiction, but archaeology confirms the scale. Excavations at Megiddo, Hazor, and Giza, mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 15, have revealed administrative structures and food storage facilities consistent with a logistical operation of that magnitude. Solomon's store cities were not luxury, they were necessity, required to sustain a court inflated by diplomatic polygamy, because that is the detail many overlook. Most of Solomon's marriages were not driven by personal desire. They were foreign policy. Each royal wife represented an alliance with a neighboring kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1 records the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter as a diplomatic act. Marrying a foreign king's daughter meant peace treaties, protected trade routes, and secure borders. Solomon transformed the marital bed into a negotiating table, but the price was absolute. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 4 through 8, records the sequence with documentary clarity. In Solomon's old age, his foreign wives turned his heart after other gods. He followed Ashtoreth, goddess of the Sidonians. He followed Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. He built a high place for Chemosh, the god of Moab, on the hill east of Jerusalem. He built another for Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, whose cult included the sacrifice of children. The man who built the Temple of Jerusalem, one of the most sacred structures in all of human history, erected altars to gods that demanded the burning of newborns. The contrast is so shattering that the biblical text itself shifts in tone. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 9 states that the Lord was angry with Solomon. The direct consequence was the division of the kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 11 through 13. After Solomon's death, the 12 tribes of Israel split into 2 kingdoms, Judah in the south with 2 tribes, and Israel in the north with 10. A nation that had taken centuries to consolidate was torn in half. And the primary cause, according to the text itself, was the foreign wives and the idolatry they introduced. Calculate the magnitude of that destruction. The United Kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon lasted approximately 73 years. The northern kingdom of Israel survived roughly 209 years before being destroyed by Assyria in 722, before the Common Era. The southern kingdom of Judah endured another 136 years before falling to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon in 586 before the Common Era. Solomon's diplomatic polygamy did not merely corrupt his personal faith, it triggered a chain reaction that culminated in the exile of an entire people, centuries of consequence for one generation of decisions. Consider the invisible human cost that is so rarely mentioned. The wives of polygamous men in ancient Israel lived in structures called Bet Hanashim, the house of the women. Archaeological records of palaces from the Iron Age II period, between 900 and 586 before the Common Era, show that these sections were isolated from the main residence. Women lived in rooms ranging from 8 to 12 square meters, with limited access to the central courtyard. An Egyptian or Sidonian princess, raised in palaces with gardens and grand halls, now shared space and a husband's attention with hundreds of other women. The depression and isolation that system produced are inferable from the biblical texts themselves. Esther chapter 2, verses 12 through 14. though describing a Persian context rather than an Israelite one, documents with precision the functioning of a royal harem. 12 months of cosmetic preparation before a single night with the king, followed by transfer to the second house of women, where the concubine remained indefinitely unless the king called her back by name. Many were never summoned again. The silence of those women is deafening in the ancient texts. Witness the moment when the biblical narrative begins to move in the opposite direction. The later prophets attacked polygamy with increasing directness, not through legal prohibitions, but through theological metaphor. Malachi chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, proclaims that God hates treachery against the wife of one's youth and demands fidelity to her. The singular is intentional. Wife, not wives. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 18, instructs a man to rejoice in the wife of his youth. Singular. Proverbs 31, the portrait of the virtuous woman is drawn in the singular as the sole partner in a monogamous marriage. The Song of Solomon, though traditionally attributed to Solomon himself, celebrates exclusive love between one man and one woman in language that admits no plurality. Song of Solomon chapter 6, verse 9, "But my dove, my perfect one, is the only one." The Hebrew word achat is emphatic, one alone, and the irony that Solomon, the man of 1,000 women, wrote or inspired the most beautiful poem about monogamous love is not accidental. It is revealing. The man who most radically departed from the ideal was still capable of recognizing, at least in poetry, that the ideal existed and was superior. Examine the details of the historical transition that unfolded in the Second Temple period between 515 before the Common Era and 70 of the Common Era. Following the Babylonian exile, polygamy declined dramatically among Jewish people. The Elephantine documents produced by a Jewish colony in Egypt dating to the 5th century before the Common Era record marriage contracts that are almost exclusively monogamous. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956 at Qumran, include the Temple Scroll, which explicitly prohibits the king from taking multiple wives. The Qumran community interpreted Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, as an absolute prohibition against polygamy, not only for the king, but for everyone. When Jesus of Nazareth was questioned about marriage in Matthew chapter 19, he did not legislate against polygamy directly. He did something more fundamental. He returned to Genesis. "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female and said, 'Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'?" Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 and 5. The two, not the three, not the four, the two. Jesus did not prohibit polygamy with a new law. He rendered it theologically untenable by restoring the original foundation. The Apostle Paul reinforced that direction in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2 and Titus chapter 1, verse 6, requiring that bishops and elders be the husband of one wife. The leadership of the early Christian community was to model the original design, and across the centuries that followed, Christianity became the only major religion of the ancient world to establish monogamy as a universal norm rather than merely a poetic ideal. Observe this narrative arc in its final scene with the clarity it demands. The biblical pattern is not a straight line of prohibition. It is a long curve that begins with the ideal in Genesis 2, plunges into the reality of sin, starting in Genesis 4 with Lamech, traverses centuries of regulated tolerance in which God protects the vulnerable within an imperfect system, and gradually returns to its point of origin. The Bible does not celebrate polygamy. It documents it with brutal honesty and shows, case after case, the trail of destruction it left behind. Abraham gained Ishmael and lost domestic peace for the rest of his life. Jacob gained 12 sons and lived inside a fratricidal hatred that nearly killed Joseph. David gained a dynasty and watched his sons violate and murder each other. Solomon gained 1,000 political alliances and lost the entire kingdom. The record is consistent across more than 1,500 years of narrative. Not a single instance of polygamy in Scripture ends without tragedy. God did not change his mind over the course of biblical history. The design was always the same. What changed was humanity's willingness to hear it, and the sacred text records both things with equal fidelity, the ideal that should have been and the reality that actually unfolded. Divine tolerance was not approval. It was patience, the same patience that regulates divorce without desiring it, that limits slavery without celebrating it, that restricts war without promoting it. A God dealing with a humanity that was not yet capable of living up to what it was designed to be. When Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament, declared that God hates treachery against the wife of one's youth, he was not introducing a new idea. He was repeating the oldest one of all, the same one that echoed in the Garden of Eden before the fall, before Lamech, before Abraham, before Solomon and his 1,000 women. One flesh. And perhaps the most revealing fact in this entire narrative is this. Among all the marriages in the Bible, the only one described without conflict, without rivalry, and without tragedy is that of Adam and Eve before the fall. One man and one woman in a garden, no competition, no comparison, no hierarchy of affection. The only perfect marriage in all of sacred scripture is also the only one that followed the original design without deviation. Everything that came after was humanity's attempt to improve upon what was already complete. And every attempt exacted its price. In the tears of women who were never loved the way they had hoped, in the blood of children who inherited rivalries they never chose, in kingdoms that collapsed because a king's heart was divided among too many loves. The story of polygamy in the Bible is not the story of a God who approved. It is the story of a humanity that insisted, and of a sacred text honest enough to record every consequence without looking away.